There's a question men hear constantly. Can men and women actually be friends? And most of them answer yes. They genuinely believe it. But watch what happens when you separate what they say from what they actually do. The pattern is consistent enough that pretending otherwise becomes exhausting. Men don't wake up one morning and decide to compartmentalize women into friendship. That's not how male psychology structures itself around female presence. What happens instead is that they accept a holding pattern. They agree to terms that feel manageable in the moment. And underneath that agreement, there's a waiting mechanism most men won't admit exists. It's not that every man is consciously scheming. That's not the framework. It's that the possibility remains active. Always. When men describe female friends, they often talk about comfort, ease, lack of pressure. And that's accurate up to a point. But comfort isn't the same thing as neutrality. Comfort just means the intensity isn't constant. It doesn't mean the wiring disappeared. Here's where the pattern clarifies itself. You take a man who insists his female friend is genuinely just a friend. No tension, no interest, no alternate timeline where things go differently. Then you introduce a single variable. She goes through a breakup. She mentions feeling alone. She starts texting more. She shows up emotionally unsteady. And suddenly the friendship doesn't operate the same way it did before. I'm not describing predatory behavior. I'm describing response patterns that activate when emotional availability shifts. Men read emotional openness as potential access. Not always, not universally, but frequently enough that calling it rare would be dishonest. The concept men struggle with is that they can hold two realities at once. They can value the friendship, they can respect the person, and they can also be waiting for a window. These things don't cancel each other out. They coexist. And the coexistence is what makes the just friends narrative so unstable. Women tend to interpret male patience as proof of platonic intent. If he's not pushing, if he's not making it weird, if he's respecting boundaries, then the friendship must be clean. That logic makes sense emotionally. But it misreads what patience actually signals in male behavioral patterns. Patience isn't the absence of intent. Patience is often strategy. Most men won't frame it that way to themselves. They won't say, I'm staying close because eventually something might shift. But the framework operates regardless of whether it's verbalized. And the moment conditions change, the friendship recalibrates. Here's the part that makes this harder to track. The shift doesn't announce itself. There's no conversation where a man says, I'm now viewing this differently. What happens instead is behavioral micro-adjustments. He responds faster. He offers more. He positions himself as the reliable constant when everything else feels unstable. From his perspective, he's being supportive. From a pattern recognition perspective, he's testing proximity. And this is where the age variable becomes impossible to ignore. Friendships that feel stable in the early 20s start bending under different pressures as both people move into their late 20s and early 30s. The context changes. Marriage becomes a consideration instead of an abstraction. People start filtering their social environments through long-term viability. And once that filter activates, friendships don't stay neutral. A woman who was just a friend at 25 becomes someone you evaluate differently at 32, not because she changed, but because the question being asked internally shifted from, is this person enjoyable to be around, to, could this person be the person? Men don't usually admit this recalibration is happening, but it shows up in how they start comparing, how they start weighing, how they start imagining alternate structures. The friend who used to be background presence suddenly gets measured against actual partners. Her qualities get inventoried. Her availability gets noted. The relationship that never had stakes suddenly carries them. And once that evaluation process starts, it doesn't reverse. Even if nothing happens. Even if the friendship continues exactly as it was on the surface. Internally, the frame already shifted. The mental file gets moved from one category to another, and that movement changes how every future interaction gets processed. What's particularly revealing is how this shift affects male behavior in ways that seem unrelated to the friendship itself. He starts mentioning her more in conversations with other people, not excessively, just enough that her presence in his life becomes more visible. He creates reasons to involve her in plans that used to be separate. He starts building structural overlap where none existed before. The problem with male female friendship isn't that it's impossible in theory, it's that the theory doesn't account for how attraction layers itself underneath familiarity. And once familiarity is already established, attraction doesn't need to build from scratch, it just needs a trigger. Most men who claim lifelong platonic female friendships are either lying or haven't been tested yet. And the test doesn't come from wanting something they can't have. The test comes when having it becomes logistically possible. That's when you see what the friendship actually was. There's a narrative that gets repeated often. We're so close that it would be weird to cross that line. And men say this with full conviction. But the conviction tends to dissolve the moment the line becomes crossable without consequence. When there's no boyfriend to complicate things. When there's no social cost. When the moment presents itself without friction. That's when men discover that the boundary they thought was fixed was actually conditional. I've watched this pattern play out enough times that treating it as exceptional stopped making sense. The men who insist they're different aren't structurally different. They just haven't encountered the conditions that expose the underlying intent yet. And women who trust the friendship because it's lasted years misread longevity as proof. Longevity just means the conditions haven't aligned. It doesn't mean the framework disappeared. Time doesn't neutralize attraction. It just spreads it out over a longer timeline. And that extended timeline often makes the intent harder to see, not easier. What makes this particularly difficult to name clearly is that men aren't performing friendship dishonestly. They're experiencing the friendship as real. The care is real. The enjoyment is real. The respect is real. But real doesn't mean exclusive. Real doesn't mean attraction isn't sitting underneath it, waiting for context to shift. The shift doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be a crisis. Sometimes it's just both people being single at the same time for the first time in years. Sometimes it's a late-night conversation that goes longer than usual. Sometimes it's just proximity when emotional defenses are lower than normal. And once that shift happens, the friendship doesn't reset. It recalibrates permanently. From that point forward, every interaction gets filtered through a lens that wasn't active before. The man who could listen without agenda now listens with possibility. The dynamic that felt neutral now carries weight. And the woman who thought the friendship was safe starts noticing small behavioral changes she can't quite name. She might notice he texts differently, not inappropriately, just more frequently, with more attention to detail. He remembers things he didn't used to track. He's suddenly available in ways that didn't seem necessary before, and if she mentions it, he'll have a reasonable explanation for every single shift. Because from his perspective, he's just being a better friend. But better friend and positioning for access often look identical from the outside. The explanations always sound legitimate. I was already in the area. I had nothing going on anyway. I figured you could use the company. Each reason stands on its own. But when you step back and look at the pattern, what you're seeing is incremental repositioning. He's not making one obvious move. He's making 20 small adjustments that collectively shift the dynamic without any single one being challengeable. This is where most people reach for the exception argument. But I know men who genuinely have female friends with zero attraction. And maybe that's true. Maybe there's a small subset of men who are wired in a way that allows complete emotional and psychological neutrality toward women they spend time with regularly. But small subsets don't define pattern behavior. And pattern behavior shows that most men operate with an availability mechanism that stays latent until conditions activate it. The men who push back hardest against this are usually the ones most vulnerable to it, because they've built an identity around being different, around being the guy who doesn't see women that way. And that identity protects them from recognizing what's actually happening internally until the moment they're already past the point of denying it. By the time he realizes he's been waiting, he's already too close to stop. And the woman who trusted the friendship because he never made it weird discovers that never making it weird was just a timeline, not a boundary. The belief that men and women can be friends without attraction layering itself into the structure isn't naive because it's hopeful. It's naive because it ignores how male attention organizes itself around female presence. And once you see how that organization works, calling it friendship starts feeling like a convenient label for something that was never actually neutral. Men don't stop being men because they agree to call it friendship. The framework stays active, the wiring stays live, and the moment circumstances shift enough to make action possible without cost, you see what the friendship was actually built on. From there, things don't go back. They just operate under a different set of rules that were always underneath the surface.